What we're about to tell you is a story that changed everything for one of the world's most famous philanthropists. When Jimmy Donaldson, MrBeast, arrived in Burkina Faso with cameras, drones, and millions of dollars worth of supplies, he thought he knew exactly what Africa needed. He was wrong. What happened next in those dusty streets would challenge everything he believed about charity, power, and what it truly means to help. A young African president was about to teach the king of YouTube a lesson that no amount of money could buy. But here's what nobody expected. The real transformation wasn't going to happen to the people MrBeast came to help. It was going to happen to him. And by the end of this story, you'll never look at charity the same way again. The convoy of white trucks kicked up clouds of red dust as they rolled through the streets of Ouagadougou at dawn. The rumble of engines mixed with the early morning sounds of the city waking up. Roosters crowing, vendors setting up their stalls, children running to school with worn backpacks bouncing on their shoulders. Word spread like wildfire through the neighborhoods over the past 3 days. Social media posts, radio announcements, whispered conversations in markets and mosques. MrBeast had come to Africa. Jimmy Donaldson stepped out of the lead vehicle as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and orange. His trademark smile beamed as he surveyed the crowd that had already begun to gather despite the early hour. The air thrummed with anticipation, and he could feel that familiar electric energy that always preceded his biggest giveaways. His crew moved with practiced efficiency around him, 23 people in total, including camera operators, sound technicians, security personnel, and logistics coordinators. They had done this dance hundreds of times before in dozens of countries. But there was something different about this location that made everyone a little more focused, a little more aware of the significance of what they were attempting. "This is incredible," Jimmy said to Marcus, his lead cameraman, gesturing at the sea of faces beginning to form in the distance. "Look at all these people. We're going to change so many lives today. This could be our biggest impact video yet." Marcus nodded, already framing shots through his lens. "The light is perfect right now. We should get the opening sequences while the sun is still low." The logistics coordinator, Sarah, approached with her clipboard and the expression of controlled chaos that had become her signature look during major operations. "Jimmy, we got confirmation that all supplies have been cleared through customs. 200 water purification systems, 500 solar panel kits, 3 tons of medical supplies, educational materials for 15 schools, and enough non-perishable food to feed 2,000 families for 3 months. And the documentation, every item cataloged, every serial number recorded, every distribution point mapped. We'll be able to track the impact for months." Sarah's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a plan coming together perfectly. Jimmy nodded, his chest swelling with that familiar feeling of purpose and power. This was what he lived for, the moment when his resources met human need, when his platform could transform entire communities with the click of an upload button. He had built his empire on the simple formula of taking vast amount of money and giving it away in increasingly spectacular fashion. And each time it felt like magic. The crowd was growing larger by the minute now, people streaming in from all directions. Children ran alongside the trucks, their bare feet slapping against the warm earth, their voices rising in excitement and anticipation. Women balanced babies on their hips while pointing toward the convoy. Elderly men sat in whatever shade they could find, watching proceedings with the patient curiosity of people who had seen many things come and go. "MrBeast, MrBeast." Some of the children called out, the English words mixed with French and local languages in a polyglot chorus of excitement. The local interpreter, a middle-aged man named Amadou, who had been recommended by the Burkina Faso embassy, stepped forward and began speaking rapidly in French to the crowd. His voice carried easily over the noise, and Jimmy watched his faces lit up with understanding and gratitude. "I've told them about the water purification systems that will provide clean drinking water for entire villages," Amadou translated back to Jimmy. "About the solar panels that will bring electricity to homes that have never had it. About the medical supplies that will stock clinics and save lives. About the education materials that will help children learn. They're very grateful, MrBeast, very excited." Jimmy felt that familiar rush of satisfaction, the dopamine hit that came from knowing he was about to make a real, measurable difference in the world. This was why he had started making videos in the first place. Not for fame or money, But for moments like this, when his success could translate into tangible improvements in people's lives. But as he prepared to address the crowd, something shifted in the atmosphere. The excited chatter didn't stop exactly, but it took on a different quality, more respectful, more anticipatory. People began to turn their heads toward something behind Jimmy, and he heard footsteps approaching on the dusty ground. A ripple of quiet respect moved through the gathered people like a wave. They began to part, creating a path down the center of the crowd, and Jimmy turned to see who was approaching with such evident reverence. Then he saw him. Ibrahim Traoré moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who belonged exactly where he was. But there was nothing arrogant or showy about his presence. He walked at an unhurried pace, nodding to individuals in the crowd as he passed, pausing briefly to touch an elderly woman's shoulder, to ruffle a child's hair, to exchange a few words with a young man in work clothes. He wasn't dressed in the military uniform that Western media often showed, nor in the expensive suits that most world leaders favored when meeting international visitors. Instead, he wore a simple white cotton tunic that seemed to glow against his dark skin, loose-fitting pants in the same pristine white, and worn leather sandals that had clearly walked many miles on many different types of terrain. There was something about his presence that made Jimmy pause mid-thought. Maybe it was the way the crowd's excited chatter softened to respectful murmurs as he passed, not out of fear, but out of genuine affection. Maybe it was a gentle authority in his movements, the way he seemed to carry himself as if he were walking through his own living room rather than making a formal state appearance. Or maybe it was simply the fact that this man, this president of a nation, had chosen to meet him, not in a palace or government building, but here in the dust and heat and noise among his people. "Mr. Donaldson," Traoré said as he approached, extending his hand with a warm smile that reached his eyes. His English was accented but clear, with the careful precision of someone who had learned the language well, but still treated it with respect. "Welcome to Burkina Faso. I am Ibrahim Traoré." Jimmy grasped the offered hand, noting immediately how callous it was, how firm a grip, how the president's palm bore the rough texture of someone who had done physical work with his hands. It was not the soft handshake of a politician who had spent his life in offices and conference rooms. "President Traoré, it's an honor to meet you," Jimmy replied, his media-trained smile automatic but genuine. "Thank you for allowing me to come here and help your people. I hope we can make a real difference today." Something flickered in Traoré's eyes. Not offense, but something deeper, more thoughtful, like a teacher who had just heard a student give an answer that revealed both understanding and misunderstanding in equal measure. "The honor is mine, Jimmy. May I call you Jimmy?" "Of course, absolutely." "Good. And you may call me Ibrahim." The president glanced at the crowd, then at the trucks with their supplies, then back at Jimmy with that same thoughtful expression. "I have a request, if you don't mind. Anything, whatever you need. Before we begin with the ceremony, before the cameras capture their magic and the supplies find their homes, would you walk with me just for a few minutes? There is something I would like to show you, something I think you should see before we proceed." Jimmy hesitated for a moment, his mind automatically calculating the disruption to their schedule. They had a tight timeline, the best light for filming, the logistics of distribution, the need to capture everything for the video that would justify this entire expensive operation. But something in Traoré's manner, a quiet certainty that seemed to suggest this wasn't really a request at all, but rather an invitation that would be unwise to decline, made him nod. "Of course, lead the way." Traoré turned to the crowd and spoke briefly in Moor, one of the local languages. His words caused nods and murmurs of understanding, and people began to disperse slightly, though many lingered, their eyes following the two men as they began to walk away from the trucks and cameras. "Should I bring someone to translate?" Jimmy asked as they started down a narrow dirt path that led away from the main road and into what appeared to be a residential area. "That won't be necessary," Traoré replied, his voice carrying that same gentle certainty. "Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the language of observation, of feeling, of simply being present with one another." They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes, and Jimmy found himself experiencing the city in a completely different way than he had from the windows of his air-conditioned truck. The smells were more intense here, with smoke from cooking fires, Spices from street food vendors, the earthy scent of red dust mixed with the green smell of plants growing in careful gardens. The sounds were different, too, not the organized noise of a crowd gathering for an event, but the organic rhythms of daily life unfolding. They passed small houses with corrugated metal roofs painted in bright blues, greens, and yellows, their walls decorated with intricate geometric patterns that spoke of artistic traditions stretching back centuries. Women sat in doorways grinding millet in wooden bowls, their movements rhythmic and practiced, creating a percussion that mixed with the sounds of children playing, radios playing music, and conversations happening in languages Jimmy couldn't identify, but somehow found comforting. What do you think Jimmy is starting to notice that he missed from his truck window? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me about your work, Jimmy. Traoré said eventually as they paused to let a small herd of goats cross their path, the animals moving with unhurried purpose, while a young boy followed behind with a stick and a patient expression. What drives you to travel so far from home to help strangers? Jimmy considered the question as they resumed walking. It wasn't the first time someone had asked him this, but something about the setting and the man asking made him want to give a more truthful answer than his usual media-friendly sound bites. I guess I've been blessed with resources. More money than I could ever spend on myself, more influence than any one person probably deserves. It feels wrong to keep it when there are people who need clean water or food or basic medical care or educational opportunities. I can make a real difference in people's lives, and I have the platform to inspire others to do the same. That is admirable, Traoré said, and there was no sarcasm in his voice, only genuine warmth and what seemed like approval. And what do you hope to achieve here, specifically in our country? Well, we've brought water purification systems that can serve thousands of people. Each unit can provide clean drinking water for up to 50 families. Solar panels to bring electricity to remote villages that have never had reliable power. Food supplies to help with nutrition, especially for children and pregnant mothers. Medical supplies that will stock clinics and potentially save hundreds of lives. Educational materials for schools that don't have adequate textbooks or learning resources. Jimmy's voice grew more animated as he spoke, his hands moving expressively. This was the part he loved most, the concrete, measurable impact that his resources could create. We're going to document everything. Show our audience exactly how their support translates into real change. Track the outcomes, measure the improvements, hopefully inspire millions of other people to give as well. It's about creating a multiplier effect, Traoré nodded thoughtfully, his expression remaining neutral but attentive. They had reached a small rise in the path, and he gestured for Jimmy to look out over the landscape spread before them. The view was breathtaking. The sun was climbing higher now, painting everything in golden light that seemed to make the entire scene glow. Below them, the city of Ouagadougou stretched out like a living tapestry. Traditional clay buildings with their distinctive flat roofs interspersed with modern structures, the whole scene alive with the smoke of cooking fires and the movement of people beginning their daily activities. In the distance, Jimmy could see farmland extending toward the horizon, green patches that spoke of careful cultivation despite the challenging climate. Beautiful, isn't it? Traoré said, his voice carrying a note of quiet pride. It really is, Jimmy replied, and he meant it completely. There was something about seeing the city from this perspective, in this light, that made him understand why people fell in love with places and chose to build their lives there despite hardships and challenges. Jimmy, may I ask you something? Of course, anything. In your country, when someone gives you a gift, what is the proper response? Jimmy looked puzzled by the apparent change of subject. To say, thank you, I guess. To be grateful, to appreciate the thought and generosity behind it. And if that person insists on taking photographs of you receiving the gift, if they bring cameras to document your gratitude, if they share those images with millions of people to show what a generous giver they are, if they make your need and their generosity into entertainment for others? The question hung in the air like the dust motes caught in the slanting rays of morning sunlight, and Jimmy felt something shift uncomfortably in his chest, an awareness creeping in that he wasn't entirely prepared to examine. I think I see what you're getting at, he said slowly, his voice less certain than it had been moments before. Do you? Traoré's voice was gentle, genuinely questioning rather than accusatory. I'm not certain you do. Not yet, but perhaps you will. They continued walking, following the path as it wound down from the rise and into a more densely populated area where the houses were closer together and the sound of community life were more intense. Jimmy found himself really looking at the people they passed for the first time since arriving in Burkina Faso, not as potential subjects for his content, not as recipients of his charity, not as grateful beneficiaries whose transformation would make for compelling video material, but as individuals living their own complex, complete lives. A woman sat braiding her daughter's hair on a wooden stool outside her home, her fingers moving with practiced expertise as she created intricate patterns, while the girl sat patiently, occasionally reaching up to feel her mother's progress. When they looked up and noticed Traoré, the woman smiled broadly and called out a greeting that made the president laugh and respond warmly. An elderly man sat in the shade of a large tree, carefully repairing a bicycle wheel with tools that looked handmade but perfectly suited to their purpose. He nodded respectfully to Traoré as they passed, then returned to his work with the focused attention of someone who took pride in doing things properly. A group of teenagers had created a makeshift football pitch in a small open area between buildings, using stones to mark the boundaries and goals made of sticks tied together with rope. Their ball was constructed from plastic bags bound tightly with string, but they played with the same intensity and joy that Jimmy had seen in professional stadiums. These people, Traoré said, following Jimmy's gaze as he watched the young footballers execute a particularly impressive passing combination. They have been receiving help from the outside world for decades. Governments, NGOs, celebrities, philanthropists, religious organizations, all coming with good intentions, all bringing resources we genuinely need and are grateful to receive. That's a good thing, right? Jimmy asked, though something in Traoré's tone suggested the answer might be more complicated than it seemed. In many ways, yes, clean water saves lives. I have seen children who would have died from waterborne diseases grow up healthy because of wells drilled by foreign aid organizations. Medicine prevents deaths. Our clinics are stocked with supplies donated by international groups. Education opens doors. Schools built with outside funding have produced teachers and engineers and doctors who serve our communities. These things matter enormously, Jimmy. I don't want you to think I'm ungrateful or that outside help isn't valuable. Traoré paused by a small shop where a woman was arranging vegetables in careful displays, each tomato, onion, and pepper placed with artistic precision that spoke of taking pride in presentation, even when resources were limited. He bought a small bag of tomatoes, chatting briefly with the woman in their shared language. She laughed at something he said, touching his arm familiarly and making some comment that caused him to throw back his head and laugh in return before she turned to serve another customer. Have you ever thought about how the way we help others affects their dignity? Let us know your thoughts below. This is getting deep. Traoré continued as they walked on, the bag of tomatoes in his hand. There is something else that happens when help always comes from outside, always comes with cameras, always comes with the assumption that we cannot solve our own problems or improve our own circumstances. What's that? We begin to see ourselves through the eyes of those helpers. We begin to internalize their assumptions about us. We begin to believe that we are broken, that we are helpless, that we are only valuable as recipients of someone else's generosity rather than as people with our own capabilities, our own solutions, our own contributions to make. Jimmy was quiet, processing this idea as they walked through what appeared to be a small market area, where vendors had set up stalls selling everything from fabric to electronics to traditional medicines. The creativity and entrepreneurship on display was obvious. People had found ways to meet their community's needs with limited resources, creating businesses and solutions that worked within their specific context. I never thought about it that way, he admitted, his voice thoughtful. Most people don't, Traoré replied, and there was no judgment in his tone, only understanding. And I don't blame them for that. The desire to help, to share resources, to alleviate suffering. These are beautiful human impulses that should be celebrated and encouraged. But sometimes, Jimmy, the way we help can be just as important as the help itself. They had entered a residential area where several families seemed to share a common courtyard space. Children were playing an elaborate game that involved jumping between chalk lines drawn on the ground, their movements creating complex patterns that Jimmy couldn't quite follow, but that obviously had rules and strategy and required considerable skill. Their laughter was infectious, and he found himself smiling despite the weight of the conversation he was having with Traoré. These children, Traoré said, watching the game with obvious enjoyment. They are brilliant. They create games, solve problems, build things from nothing. They have hopes and dreams and plans for their futures. They study hard in school. They help their families. They take care of each other. They are not broken. They are not helpless. They are not victims waiting for rescue. They are simply human beings living in a place where certain resources are scarce. As if summoned by their conversation, a small boy, maybe 8 years old, approached him with the curious boldness that seemed characteristic of children everywhere. He was carrying something in his hands that he held carefully, protectively, and as he got closer, Jimmy could see that it was a small carved wooden animal that looked like a lion. The detail work was intricate and beautiful, clearly the product of hours of careful attention and considerable skill. The boy seemed slightly shy as he approached Traoré, but not intimidated. He spoke in more, his voice growing more confident as he continued, holding up the carving and pointing to different aspects of it, clearly explaining his work with the pride of a craftsman discussing his latest creation. "This is Kofi," Traoré translated for Jimmy, kneeling down to the boy's level to better examine the carving. He made this lion himself, working on it every day after school for 2 weeks. He's telling me about how he carved the mane, how he had to be very careful not to break the thin legs, how he used different tools for different parts. He says he wants to be an engineer when he grows up to build bridges and buildings that will help his community. Jimmy knelt down as well, studying the carving more closely. It really was beautiful work, the kind of attention to detail and artistic vision that would be impressive coming from someone twice Kofi's age. The wood had been sanded smooth and showed evidence of careful finishing work. The proportions were accurate, the expression on the lion's carved face somehow conveying both strength and gentleness. "This is incredible work," Jimmy said to the boy, who beamed with pride, even though he might not have understood the English words. The universal language of appreciation for craftsmanship seemed to bridge the gap. "Kofi's father is a carpenter," Traoré continued, still speaking with the boy, who was now showing him how he had attached the lion's tail, pointing to the joint where 2 pieces of wood had been carefully fitted together. He's teaching his son the traditional woodworking techniques that have been passed down in their family for generations. But he's also encouraging him to dream bigger, to use those skills as a foundation for education and career opportunities that weren't available to previous generations. "And his mother?" Jimmy asked, genuinely curious now about this child whose talent had captured his attention. "She's a teacher at the local primary school. She makes sure Kofi does his homework before he works on his carvings, and she's been helping him learn English because she believes it will open doors for him." Traoré smiled. "They don't have much money, but they have something perhaps more valuable, a belief that Kofi can create his own future, combined with the practical support to help him do it." The boy, apparently having finished his technical explanation of the lion's construction, looked directly at Jimmy and held out the carving, gesturing for him to take it. Jimmy looked at Traoré questioningly, unsure of the protocol for the situation. "He wants to give it to you as a gift," Traoré explained. "In our culture, when we welcome someone into our home and he considers his neighborhood his home, we share what we have. It's how we show respect and friendship." Jimmy felt a lump forming in his throat as he accepted the carving. The wood was warm from Kofi's hands, smooth where it had been carefully sanded, and surprisingly heavy for its size. This child, who had so little by material standards, no video game systems, no expensive toys, no trust fund waiting for him when he turned 18, was giving away something he had spent 2 weeks creating, something that represented hours of patient work and considerable skill. "Thank you," Jimmy said, looking directly into Kofi's bright, intelligent eyes. "Thank you so much. This is beautiful, and I can see how much work you put into it. I'm honored to receive it." Kofi grinned and said something and more that made Traoré chuckle. He says he hopes the lion will bring you good luck on your journey, and that maybe someday, when he's an engineer, he'll build something for you. The boy ran back to his friends, quickly becoming absorbed in their chalk line jumping game again. But Jimmy found himself continuing to stare at the wooden lion in his hands. "Jimmy," Traoré said as they stood up, brushing dust from their knees, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you respond." "Okay, When you look at Kofi, what do you see? Jimmy considered this carefully, still holding the carved lion and watching the boy play with his friends. I see a talented kid, creative, generous, hardworking, someone with a lot of potential, with supportive parents who are investing in his future. I see someone who's going to accomplish great things if he gets the opportunities he deserves. Good. That's exactly right. Traoré nodded approvingly. Now, when you arrived here today with your trucks and cameras and crew, when you looked at the crowd that had gathered to meet you, what did you see? The question hit Jimmy like a physical blow because he realized with uncomfortable clarity that he hadn't really seen individuals at all. He had seen an audience, a community in need, a group of people who would benefit from his generosity and whose gratitude would make for compelling content. He had seen numbers, 2,000 families to feed, 50 villages to provide with clean water, 15 schools to stock with supplies. He had seen the raw material for his next viral video about changing lives and making a difference. But he hadn't seen Kofi. He hadn't seen the woman braiding her daughter's hair, or the man repairing the bicycle, or the teenagers playing football with their makeshift ball. He hadn't seen individuals with their own talents, dreams, solutions, and dignity. I'm starting to understand, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I hope so, Traoré replied, his tone gentle but serious. Because understanding is the first step toward a different kind of help, the kind that builds up rather than maintains dependence. The kind that recognizes the dignity and capability of every person, even when they lack certain material resources. The kind that sees people like Kofi not as beneficiaries of charity, but as partners in building a better world. They walked on through the gathering afternoon heat, past more homes and families, past small businesses and community gathering places, past a clinic where a doctor was seeing patients under a tree because the building was too small to accommodate everyone who needed care, past a school where children sat on wooden benches in an open-air classroom, their voices rising and falling as they recited lessons in unison. Jimmy found himself seeing everything differently now, noticing the innovations and solutions people had created for themselves, the networks of support and cooperation that existed independently of any outside aid, the evidence of human creativity and resilience that flourished even in challenging circumstances. You know, Traoré said eventually as they paused to watch a group of women working together to prepare food for what appeared to be a community event. Burkina Faso means land of upright people in our local languages. Upright not because we think we're better than others, but because we believe in standing on our own feet, in facing our challenges with dignity, in working together to solve our problems. That's beautiful, Jimmy said, meaning it completely. We have problems, of course, real problems that affect real people. Poverty that limits opportunities and shortens lives. Drought that threatens crops and livestock. Security challenges that force people from their homes. Limited infrastructure that makes basic services harder to access. Traoré's voice grew more serious as he continued. These are not abstract issues, Jimmy. They impact every family in our country in some way. And we are genuinely grateful for help when it comes. The water systems you brought will save lives. The medical supplies will prevent suffering. The education materials will open minds and create opportunities. These are gifts that matter enormously. But, Jimmy prompted, sensing there was more. But we are not defined by our problems, Jimmy. We are defined by how we respond to them, by the strength and creativity and love we show in the face of difficulty. We are defined by people like Kofi, who creates beauty with his hands and dreams of building bridges. We are defined by teachers who work without adequate supplies, but still inspire their students to reach for more. We are defined by doctors who save lives with limited resources, and entrepreneurs who build businesses from nothing, and mothers who raise children to believe in themselves despite every obstacle. They had circled back toward the main road, where Jimmy's convoy waited. But they took a different route that led them past more of the city's daily life. The crowd had grown considerably larger in their absence, and excitement was palpable even from a distance. Jimmy could see his crew setting up lights and checking cameras, preparing for the kind of spectacle that had made him famous around the world. But now the prospect of that spectacle made him feel slightly sick to his stomach. This is hitting different now, isn't it? What would you do in Jimmy's situation? Comment boulot? Ibrahim. He said, stopping just before they would rejoin the crowd and the cameras and the whole machinery of his charity operation. I think I've been doing this all wrong. Not wrong, Traoré corrected gently, his hand briefly touching Jimmy's shoulder. Incomplete. Perhaps your heart is in the right place, Jimmy. Your desire to help is genuine, and the resources you brought will make a real difference in people's lives. But there are ways to help that honor the people you're helping, that recognize their agency and dignity and capability. How? I mean, practically speaking, how do I do that? Ask them what they need instead of assuming you know. Work with them instead of for them. Share the spotlight instead of claiming it. Measure success not just by what you give, but by what people are able to build for themselves afterward. Tell stories that show them as the heroes of their own lives rather than as grateful recipients of your generosity. And the cameras, the content? I mean, I need to document this for my audience. They expect that, and it's how I fund the next project. Traoré smiled, and Jimmy caught a glimpse of the strategic mind that had made this young man a successful leader. Tell different stories, Jimmy. Instead of look how much I gave, try look what these amazing people accomplished. Instead of showing yourself as a hero who saved the day, show them as the heroes who were already working to save themselves and just needed some additional resources to accelerate their progress. They rejoined the crowd, and the noise and excitement washed over them again like a wave. The energy was infectious. Children calling out greetings, adults clapping and singing, the whole atmosphere charged with anticipation for what was about to unfold. But now Jimmy heard it differently, not as appreciation for his presence, not as gratitude for his generosity, but as a community preparing to celebrate together, to welcome guests, to share an experience that would hopefully benefit everyone involved. MrBeast, MrBeast. Children called out, and he waved and smiled, but with a new awareness of what his presence meant to them and what responsibilities came with that awareness. Traoré addressed the crowd briefly and more, his words causing nods and murmurs of approval throughout the gathering. His voice carried easily across the space, and Jimmy noticed how people leaned in to listen, how children quieted down to hear what their president was saying, how adults nodded thoughtfully at various points in his speech. When he finished, Traoré turned to Jimmy with a smile that seemed to contain multitudes. Warmth, challenge, hope, and something that might have been pride. I've told them that you brought gifts that will help our community, but more importantly, that you've come to learn from them as well. I've explained that instead of a ceremony where you give and they receive, we're going to have a celebration where everyone shares what they have to offer, their talents, their stories, their wisdom, their hospitality, and they're okay with that, Jimmy. Traoré laughed. They're excited about it. This is how we prefer to do things anyway, as a community, together, with everyone contributing something to the whole. What followed was unlike anything Jimmy had ever experienced in his years of philanthropic work. Instead of a formal distribution ceremony with himself at the center, handing out supplies while cameras captured the gratitude of recipients, the afternoon became a genuine community celebration that seemed to unfold organically and beautifully. Local musicians appeared with traditional instruments, drums, flutes, and stringed instruments Jimmy didn't recognize, and began playing music that made people want to move and dance. The donated supplies were distributed not by Jimmy and his crew, but by community leaders who knew exactly which families needed what most urgently and could ensure everything reached the people who would benefit most. Children demonstrated their games and taught Jimmy's crew how to play, creating hilarious scenes of grown American videographers trying to master the chalk line jumping game, while 8-year-olds offered patient instruction. Women showed Jimmy and his team how they prepared traditional foods, explaining the nutritional and cultural significance of different ingredients, while inviting them to help with the cooking process. Men explained their various crafts and trades. The carpenter who was teaching Kofi, a blacksmith who created beautiful and functional tools from scrap metal, a weaver who made textiles using patterns that told stories of family and community history. Farmers talked about their innovative techniques for growing crops in challenging conditions, describing methods of water conservation and soil management that had been developed through generations of careful observation and experimentation. Jimmy found himself genuinely engaged in ways he hadn't expected, asking questions that went beyond the superficial, learning about topics he had never considered, laughing at jokes that transcended language barriers. His cameras rolled throughout, but they captured something completely different from his usual content. Not the spectacle of his generosity, but the richness and complexity of a community that was sharing its culture and wisdom with visitors who had come bearing gifts. "This is incredible," Marcus whispered to Jimmy during a brief break in filming as they watched a group of teenagers perform a traditional dance while explaining its historical significance. "This is some of the most authentic, engaging content we've ever captured. People are going to love seeing this." And Jimmy realized that Marcus was right, but for reasons that went deeper than just good content. What they were documenting was a different model of interaction entirely, one based on mutual respect and genuine cultural exchange rather than the simple transaction of charity given and gratitude received. As the afternoon progressed, Jimmy found himself drawn into conversations that challenged his assumptions about development, aid, and what it meant to help effectively. A doctor at the local clinic explained how foreign medical donations were most useful when they complemented local knowledge of traditional healing rather than trying to replace it entirely. A teacher described how education materials worked best when they were adapted to local languages and cultural contexts rather than simply translated from English. "The water purification systems you've brought," said an engineer who had studied in France but returned to Burkina Faso to work on infrastructure projects. "They're excellent technology, but what makes them truly valuable is that we've been training local technicians to maintain and repair them so communities won't be dependent on outside expertise to keep them running." "That's brilliant," Jimmy replied, and he meant it. "How long does that training take?" 6 months for basic maintenance, 18 months for full repair capabilities. We've already identified candidates in each village where the systems will be installed. Young people like Kofi's older brother, who has mechanical aptitude and leadership potential. So the impact extends beyond just the clean water. Exactly. The systems provide immediate benefit, but the training creates local expertise and employment opportunities. It's a model that builds capacity rather than dependence. These conversations were happening throughout the celebration, as Jimmy discovered over and over again that the people he had come to help had already been working on sophisticated solutions to their challenges, and that his contribution was most valuable when it supported and amplified their existing efforts rather than trying to replace them. Holding Kofi's wooden lion and listening to stories about the history and culture of Burkina Faso, Jimmy realized he was no longer the hero of the story. The heroes were the people around him: the children, the parents, the teachers, the doctors, the farmers, the entrepreneurs, who were building their futures with creativity, resilience, and dignity long before he arrived and long after he would leave.